The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that made your skin crawl. Pam Bondi stood at the entrance, eyes scanning the room as if searching for something hidden, something that could tip the scales in her favor. She had been through countless high-stakes cases, but today felt different, like something was about to explode. The moment she stepped forward, the weight of the eyes in the room shifted, all focusing on her as she made her way to the front. But it wasn't the defendant she was worried about. No, today her real challenge stood at the bench, Judge Howard Gates. The man was notorious for his cruel words and brutal unpredictability. Bondi had heard the stories. A judge who used his power not just to rule, but to intimidate, to destroy anyone who stood in his way. She had prepared for every possible scenario, but not this. The case she was fighting today wasn't just any corruption case. It was one that could unravel a whole system, exposing dirty deals that reached the very core of political power. She was ready for that fight. What she hadn't anticipated, though, was the twisted game that Gates was about to play. As she walked into the courtroom, she could already feel the tension crackling in the air, thick and dangerous. This wasn't just a trial. It was a trap. And soon, she would realize that the judge she had to outsmart wasn't just behind the bench. He was a part of the corruption she was trying to uncover. The moment Pam Bondi approached the bench, Judge Howard Gates barely acknowledged her presence. His eyes stayed fixed on a stack of papers in front of him as if he had all the time in the world. There was no welcoming nod, no gesture of acknowledgement, just cold indifference. The silence in the room stretched long and awkward, amplifying the tension. Bondi stood there, waiting for him to address her, but Gates made no move to do so. The courtroom fell into a heavy stillness, as if everyone was waiting for the next move. Finally, without even lifting his gaze, Gates spoke. His voice was dripping with sarcasm. "Miss Bondi, I assume you've prepared something of substance today, or should we just skip ahead to the part where you waste my time?" His words hung in the air like an accusation, drawing a few chuckles from the back of the courtroom, most of them coming from the defendant's legal team. Pam didn't flinch. She had been through much worse in her career and wasn't about to let his cheap shot rattle her. Her voice was calm, controlled, and firm as she replied. "Your Honor, I believe the evidence will speak for itself. This case is about misuse of taxpayer dollars. My job is to present the facts clearly and accurately." A small smirk tugged at the corner of Gates's lips, but he didn't look up. He leaned back in his chair as if bored. "Taxpayer dollars, right? Because that's never the foundation of a frivolous case," he muttered, his tone dismissive. Bondi's jaw tightened, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she met his cold gaze and pressed on, keeping her composure. "Respectfully, Your Honor, I would hardly call felony corruption charges frivolous." The challenge was subtle, but everyone in the room could feel the weight of her words. Their eyes locked for a moment, and then, without missing a beat, Gates cut her off again. "Spare me the lectures, Miss Bondi. Get to the point. I don't have all day to entertain whatever grandstanding you have planned." The tension in the room thickened as Judge Gates continued to goad Pam Bondi. His sharp tone and dismissive remarks were clearly designed to rattle her, but Bondi didn't show the slightest sign of being affected. Instead, she took a slow, measured breath and picked up the file in front of her. She was here to do a job, and no amount of taunting would derail her focus. "Well, Miss Bondi," Gates began, his voice oozing with sarcasm, "this is going to be a fascinating show, isn't it? A case about taxpayer dollars, right? How charming." He didn't even bother to look up from his papers, his fingers flipping through the file at a glacial pace as if he were doing something far more important than presiding over a courtroom. Bondi stood her ground. She had faced tougher, more ruthless opponents in her career, but this felt different. Gates wasn't just challenging her legal skills. He was trying to undermine her, to make her feel small in front of everyone in the room. It was personal, and she knew it. "You're right about one thing, Your Honor," Bondi said evenly, holding his gaze. "This case is about taxpayer dollars. It's about ensuring that money meant for the public good is not being misused for personal gain. I'm here to make sure that the facts are heard." The courtroom was dead silent now, all eyes on the two of them. Gates finally looked up from his papers, meeting her gaze for the first time. His expression was almost casual, but there was an unmistakable gleam of hostility in his eyes. "Of course," he sneered. "The facts. Always the facts. Because it's not like we've ever seen someone try to make a mountain out of a molehill using facts before." He leaned back in his chair, looking every bit the seasoned judge who thought he had all the power in the room. Bondi's hand tightened around the folder in front of her, but her voice remained calm. Your Honor, these are not molehills. These are felony charges involving misuse of public funds. This is about corruption at the highest levels. If we don't address it here, it won't be addressed at all. Gates's lips curled into a thin smile, one that barely masked the contempt he was clearly feeling. Oh, please. We don't need another lecture on corruption. I'm sure your evidence will do a much better job of proving the world's worst-kept secret. Bondi's jaw clenched, but she didn't let the frustration show. Instead, she stepped forward slightly, her voice cutting through the tension. Your Honor, I'm not here to lecture anyone. I'm here to present the truth. The evidence I'm about to show will leave no room for doubt. Before she could continue, Gates cut her off once again, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Drowning people in paperwork, are we? Or is this just your way of compensating for your lack of substance? His words were sharp, calculated, and meant to humiliate. The room shifted. There was a soft rustle behind her as the prosecution team exchanged glances. Even the reporters in the back seemed to shift uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't just about legal procedures anymore. This was a battle for control, and Judge Gates was doing everything in his power to throw Bondi off balance. But Bondi remained unfazed. She had dealt with people like Gates before, men who thought their power was unshakable. She knew that the only way to take them down was to never let them see you rattle. I'm not here to waste anyone's time, Your Honor, she said, her tone even, but her words carrying weight. I'm here to ensure that the facts are heard. If you prefer to continue making this personal, I'm happy to request a recess while we address any professional concerns you may have. The judge's expression flickered for a moment. Amusement? Annoyance? It was hard to tell, but what was clear was that he wasn't done with her yet. Oh, I have no concerns, Miss Bondi, he said with a mocking chuckle. I just know a weak case when I see one. This time, a ripple of gasps spread through the courtroom. The tension had escalated to a breaking point. Bondi could feel the weight of every eye on her. Even the jury was watching closely now, sensing that something was off. A judge wasn't supposed to act like this. Not in the middle of a case, not in the face of facts and evidence. But Judge Gates wasn't behaving like a neutral party. He was acting as though he had something to hide. Bondi squared her shoulders and raised her chin, refusing to let him intimidate her. Then let the evidence do the talking, Your Honor. But she noticed it then, the subtle shift in his expression. It wasn't just arrogance or condescension this time. There was something deeper behind his eyes, something that made her pause. It was as if he knew something she didn't, as if he had a stake in the outcome of the case. A flicker of realization passed through her. This wasn't just about courtroom theatrics. Judge Gates wasn't just being combative for sport. He was playing a game. And for the first time, she began to wonder just how deep the corruption ran. The room felt charged with energy as Bondi flipped open the file in front of her, ready to present the next piece of evidence. She was determined not to let Judge Gates continue his charade any longer. With a steady hand, she picked up a folder from the table and turned toward the jury, her voice clear and unwavering. Your Honor, she began, I'd like to direct the court's attention to Exhibit A. She paused for a moment, making sure she had everyone's attention. Slowly, she pulled out the financial records and placed them on the projector for everyone to see. Gates barely glanced at them. His expression remained unchanged, as if the numbers on the screen meant nothing to him. His voice interrupted before Bondi could even begin her explanation. Do you always insist on drowning people in paperwork? He asked, his voice carrying that smug, condescending edge. Or is this just your way of compensating for your lack of substance? The insult landed with a sharpness that echoed throughout the courtroom. The defense attorney stifled a chuckle, and Bondi could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her. For a split second, she felt the familiar pulse of frustration, but she buried it. She wasn't here to engage in petty back and forths. She was here for justice, and that was the only thing that mattered. The silence in the room was thick, but Bondi kept her voice calm. Respectfully, Your Honor, these financial records clearly show discrepancies that need to be addressed. She paused just long enough to make her point. This case involves the misuse of taxpayer funds. If the evidence doesn't matter to you, it certainly matters to the people who work hard for every dollar they earn. A few murmurs spread through the gallery as Bondi's words hung in the air. She knew she had made her point, but Gates wasn't going to let her have the last word. Frivolous accusations again? Gates scoffed. Taxpayer money, corruption, grandstanding, all the usual buzzwords. You've seen enough of this charade to know better than to waste my time, Miss Bondi. Bondi's jaw tightened, but her expression remained neutral. She had expected this. She had been in enough high-pressure cases to know when a judge was trying to intimidate her. Gates had done it all, questioning her methods, undermining her evidence, and now dismissing her entire case without even considering the facts. But she was done letting him control the conversation. "Your Honor," she said evenly, keeping her voice steady, "I am not here to waste anyone's time. This is not a circus act." She took a deep breath, her mind racing through the strategy she had spent so long perfecting. This is about justice. This is about ensuring that the people responsible for stealing from taxpayers are held accountable. The room was quiet now, the intensity of the moment settling over everyone like a heavy weight. Even the defense team had stopped whispering. They were watching closely, sensing that something was shifting. The judge wasn't just being difficult now. He was trying to bury this case, to dismiss it before it even began. But Bondi wasn't going to let him. She turned back to the screen, her voice unwavering. "If you'd like, Your Honor, we can skip to the next piece of evidence." Gates stared at her for a long moment. She could feel the coldness in his gaze, like a challenge in itself. He had never been fond of being questioned, and it was clear now that he was digging in. But Bondi stood her ground, knowing that this was just another attempt to knock her off balance. "Proceed," Gates finally muttered, his tone laced with disdain. "But let's keep it brief." Bondi didn't respond to his jibe. Instead, she took a step forward, unflinching, and moved to the next exhibit. She had to keep the momentum going. If she let Gates control the pace of this hearing any longer, it would be over before it had even begun. As she reached for the next file, the atmosphere in the courtroom seemed to shift. The once dominant figure of Judge Gates, with his sharp words and controlling attitude, seemed smaller somehow. And for the first time, Bondi felt as if she was the one in control. Bondi's fingers tightened around the folder she had just picked up. She was about to present her strongest piece of evidence yet. This was it. The moment that would turn the tide of the case. The documents she was holding were damning, and she knew that once they were revealed, the room would never be the same. She flipped the folder open, her eyes quickly scanning the information to ensure she had everything in order. "Your Honor, if you would direct your attention to Exhibit B," she said firmly, lifting the financial records toward the projection screen. The numbers were clear, showing that the defendant's company had received nearly triple the amount of state funding originally approved for its project. She paused, giving everyone in the room time to absorb the numbers. The evidence was undeniable, and there was no way to explain away such a blatant discrepancy. Bondi's heart beat steadily in her chest. This was the moment she had been working for. Everything had led up to this. But before she could say another word, Judge Gates cut her off, his voice dripping with sarcasm once again. "I hate to interrupt your presentation, really I do," he said, leaning back in his chair. "But I think we've seen enough numbers for one day." The courtroom was silent for a heartbeat, and then Bondi felt it. The pressure of his dismissal, the weight of his authority trying to silence her. For a brief moment, she felt the sting of frustration, but she immediately pushed it aside. She knew better than to let him win. This wasn't about him. This was about making sure that the truth was heard, no matter how hard he tried to bury it. "Your Honor," she said, her voice unwavering, "with all due respect, these numbers are the foundation of this case. Without them, we have nothing." She gestured to the screen, where the figures clearly outlined the fraudulent activity that had taken place. This is where the corruption begins, and it must be acknowledged. Gates let out a low, mocking chuckle, clearly uninterested in the facts. "And yet I fail to see how any of this justifies wasting the court's time," he sneered. "What's next? Another stack of paperwork?" Bondi's grip on the folder tightened. She knew he was trying to push her buttons to get her to react, but she wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Instead, she took a slow, deliberate breath and looked at the judge, her eyes steady and unyielding. "I am not here to waste anyone's time, Your Honor. I am here to make sure that justice is served," she said firmly, her words cutting through the tension in the room. "And that means presenting the evidence, no matter how uncomfortable it may make you." The courtroom was now fully engaged, everyone leaning forward to catch every word. The defense team had gone completely quiet, and even the jury seemed to be paying close attention. Gates, for all his arrogance and dismissive behavior, could feel the shift. He had underestimated her. Bondi's voice dropped, barely above a whisper, but sharp and direct. "I know you're trying to shut this case down, Your Honor. I know you're trying to bury the truth, but I won't let that happen." The judge's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, Bondi made her move. She flipped to the next page in her file, presenting more evidence. She wasn't going to let him derail her. Not now, not after everything she had worked for. These documents show a clear pattern of illegal activity. Funds were misallocated and records were falsified, she said. The tone of her voice remained calm, but there was a clear edge to it now, a determination that couldn't be ignored. Gates's face hardened, his eyes flickering briefly to the projection screen. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. It was clear he was desperate to stop her, to prevent the evidence from coming to light. But Bondi wasn't backing down. "Your Honor," she continued, "the defendant's company received almost double the approved amount of funding, and yet not a single penny is accounted for in the state records. This is not a minor mistake. This is deliberate fraud." Gates leaned forward in his chair, his hands gripping the arms of it as if trying to hold on to something. His fingers tapped nervously on the bench, betraying his growing unease. Bondi could feel it now. He was rattled. The walls he had built around himself were starting to crack, but he still wasn't finished. "This is absurd," Gates muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "You're reaching, Miss Bondi. This entire case is built on speculation." Bondi ignored his taunts and continued. "The facts speak for themselves, Your Honor. The evidence is clear, and if you refuse to acknowledge it, I'll make sure the world knows exactly why." There was a beat of silence, the tension thickening by the second. Then, without another word, Bondi pulled out the final piece of her evidence, something that would shatter everything. She placed a small recorder on the table and pressed play. The low, gruff voice that filled the room was unmistakable. "Take care of it. I don't care how. Make sure she doesn't get her hands on those ledgers." The room went dead silent. All eyes were on Bondi as the recording continued, the voices clear and damning. "Make sure she doesn't get her hands on the ledgers." The words hung in the air, every person in the room realizing the truth. Judge Gates was involved, and for the first time, he couldn't hide from it. Gates didn't move. He didn't flinch. But his face went pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had just been caught, and there was no way out. Bondi didn't look at him. She didn't need to. The truth had been laid bare for everyone to see, and the judge had no choice but to face it. The moment the recording ended, the courtroom was plunged into an eerie silence. The air seemed to hang heavy, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. For a long moment, nobody moved. Bondi sat still, her gaze fixed firmly on the recorder in front of her, as if daring anyone to challenge what they had just heard. Gates remained motionless, his face drained of color, his lips pressed into a thin line. The weight of the revelation had hit him like a freight train, and there was nowhere for him to hide. The courtroom, once filled with tension, now seemed to buzz with a quiet energy. Whispers began to ripple through the gallery, the reality of what had just unfolded sinking in. The defense attorney's smug expression had vanished. In its place was something closer to dread. He turned to look at the defendant, Charles Lawson, who now looked a lot less confident than when he had first entered the courtroom. The developer, usually so composed, seemed unnerved, his hand gripping the edge of the table, knuckles white. Bondi didn't flinch. She kept her eyes fixed on Gates, who had yet to speak. His silence said more than any words could. He knew the game was up. He had been caught, and there was no escape. Then, just as the tension in the room reached its peak, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway outside. The door at the back of the courtroom swung open, and two uniformed officers entered. Their presence was a stark reminder of the gravity of the situation. The officers walked toward Gates, one of them reaching into his pocket, the other pulling out a pair of handcuffs. The room was in shock. People gasped as they realized what was happening. Even the stenographer paused, the tapping of the keys halting as everyone turned their attention to the judge. Gates didn't speak. He didn't even try to resist. For the first time in his life, the man who had ruled over countless courtrooms with all his arrogance and authority found himself on the receiving end of the law. His eyes flickered toward Bondi, but he didn't say a word. The officers moved swiftly, securing the handcuffs around his wrists. "This is absurd," Gates muttered, his voice weak and disbelieving. He was trying to assert some form of control, but it was too late. His words lacked the power they once held. "You have the right to remain silent," one of the officers said, his voice firm. "But you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud, and abuse of judicial power. You will have the opportunity to speak with an attorney." The officer didn't wait for a response. He simply turned, pulling Gates by the arm as the judge sat there, staring blankly ahead. The other officer stood next to him, watching for any signs of resistance. But Gates didn't move. His defiance was gone, replaced by a hollow sense of defeat. The sound of the cuffs clicking shut was deafening. It was the sound of a fall from grace, a once powerful figure being reduced to nothing more than a criminal in the eyes of the law. Bondi stood up slowly, her face calm, but her heart racing. This was the moment she had worked for, the moment when justice was finally served. But there was no triumph in her expression. She wasn't here for revenge. She was here for accountability, and that's exactly what had just happened. As the officers led Gates toward the exit, Bondi took a moment to compose herself. The gallery was still, the weight of what had just occurred hanging in the air. This wasn't just about one corrupt judge. This was a larger statement. No one, no matter how powerful, was above the law. But there was still work to be done. The trial wasn't over yet. As the officers escorted Gates out of the courtroom, Bondi glanced back at the defendant, Charles Lawson, whose smugness had now been replaced with something far less certain. "Ms. Bondi," the bailiff called out, breaking the silence. "The court will now resume." Bondi nodded, her voice calm as she turned back to the judge's empty seat. "Thank you, officer," she said, then turned to the defense table, her focus now entirely on the case at hand. "Let's continue." With Gates gone, the power dynamic in the room had completely shifted. The once intimidating figure behind the bench was now nothing more than a criminal being led away in cuffs. Bondi stood tall, the weight of the moment not lost on her. She had made it clear that no one, no matter how high they thought they were, could escape justice. The prosecution team beside her exchanged looks. They could see it too. The case had just taken a turn, and they were all in it together. The shift in the room was palpable. Bondi was now the one in control, and the trial, though far from over, had already been marked by something far bigger than any one case, something that would reverberate far beyond this courtroom. With Judge Gates now gone, the courtroom atmosphere had shifted. What had been a tense, almost hostile environment was now filled with a sense of anticipation. The defense attorney, who had once seemed so sure of his position, now looked rattled, his confident posture deflated. The weight of Gates's arrest hung over him, and Bondi knew this was her chance to finish what she had started. She turned to face the jury, her expression steady. The evidence she had just presented, along with the shocking turn of events, had already shaken the defense. She wasn't about to let them regroup or find a way out. She needed to press forward and finish the job. "Your Honor," Bondi began, her voice carrying authority, "as we proceed with the case, I will continue to present the evidence that shows beyond a shadow of a doubt the corruption that has plagued this entire project. The financial records we have already discussed are just the tip of the iceberg." The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had no retort, no sharp words to throw back at Bondi. He was on the defensive now, and there was nothing he could do to regain control of the situation. Bondi moved forward, grabbing the next set of documents she needed. The pages she held were damning. She could feel the room growing heavier with every word she spoke. The facts spoke for themselves, and she wasn't going to let anyone ignore them. "This document," Bondi said, placing it in front of the jury, "shows that the defendant's company received nearly double the amount of funds it was entitled to, and there is no record of what happened to the excess funds. We have also traced these funds to an offshore account linked to the defendant." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The defense attorney shot her a sharp look, but Bondi didn't back down. She continued, undeterred by the growing tension in the room. "And this document," Bondi added, placing another sheet in front of the jury, "is a contract signed by the defendant and the city's planning board. The contract was for a project with a listed cost of just over $2 million. However, the actual funds transferred for the project were nearly $4 million. Bondi paused for a moment, letting the numbers sink in. She could see the jury members leaning forward, their eyes fixed on the evidence she was presenting. Even the stenographer seemed to be paying closer attention now. The room was quiet. Too quiet, as the weight of her words settled in. She could feel the shift in the room, the change in the energy. This wasn't just a trial anymore. This was a battle for truth and integrity, and she was winning it. But the defense wasn't done yet. "I'll remind the court," the defense attorney said, his voice shaky but attempting to regain some form of authority, "that these documents are being presented without proper verification. There's no proof that these funds were misused." Bondi didn't flinch. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, "the proof is right here. The financial discrepancies are clear. The defendant has used his political connections to cover his tracks. It's time we stop pretending this is anything but what it is, a case of fraud, corruption, and abuse of power." The defense attorney opened his mouth to speak again, but stopped himself. There was nothing more he could say. Bondi had cornered him, and now the defense team was left with no options. The prosecution was winning, and everyone in the room knew it. As she turned back to the jury, Bondi's eyes met the defendant's gaze. Charles Lawson sat rigid in his seat, trying to maintain his composure, but it was clear he was feeling the pressure. The smirk that had been so prevalent on his face earlier was gone, replaced by an expression of uncertainty. For the first time, Lawson seemed to realize the gravity of the situation. His empire, built on backroom deals and political favors, was crumbling, and there was no one left to protect him. The walls were closing in, and Bondi was about to deliver the final blow. "Mr. Lawson," she said, her voice calm but firm, "you can continue to deny the evidence, or you can do the right thing. The truth has already been exposed. Your attempts to silence it have failed. Now it's time for you to face the consequences of your actions." Lawson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. He didn't respond immediately, but his silence spoke volumes. The once confident developer now found himself backed into a corner with nowhere to run. Finally, after a long pause, Lawson exhaled sharply. I think we need to talk," he said, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. "I'll cooperate, but I need protection. I have information, important information. If I talk, I'll need assurances." Bondi's eyes narrowed slightly. She had suspected that Lawson was trying to find a way out, but this was a surprise. It wasn't enough for him to simply admit his wrongdoing. He wanted protection in exchange for his cooperation. He was offering a deal, but Bondi wasn't about to make it easy for him. "You'll get nothing without the truth, Mr. Lawson," she replied coolly, her tone unyielding. "And if you think you can bargain your way out of this, you're mistaken." She paused for a moment, letting the weight of her words sink in. "You will speak, and you will speak the truth. Only then will we consider any further discussions." Lawson looked at her for a moment, weighing his options. Finally, he exhaled, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I'll talk," he said quietly, "but I want protection and a deal." Bondi straightened up. The power dynamic in the room had shifted completely. The case was no longer in the hands of a corrupt judge. It was in hers. She turned toward the jury. "We've exposed corruption at the highest levels, but this is far from over. This is just the beginning of uncovering the full scope of what has happened here." She looked at the defense table, where Lawson sat quietly now, a man broken by the weight of his own actions. "We will not rest until every person involved in this conspiracy is held accountable." As Bondi moved to continue with the case, the courtroom was filled with a sense of finality. The biggest obstacle had been removed. Now, the road ahead was clear. Justice was on its way, and nobody was going to stop it. The room felt different now. The walls that once protected the powerful were starting to crack, and Pam Bondi had made sure of that. The system still worked, and no matter how high someone thought they could rise, the truth would always catch up with them. As the final words of the trial echoed in the courtroom, a sense of accomplishment filled the air. Bondi sat at the prosecution table, her fingers resting lightly on the evidence she had just presented. The fight was far from over, but the most significant battle had already been won. The corrupt judge, the twisted network of fraud and manipulation, had been exposed, and it was clear that the truth had finally broken through. The courtroom had become a different place. What had started as a tense, nearly unbearable conflict had transformed into a space for justice to prevail. The defense team, once so confident in their position, was now lost for words. The defendant, Charles Lawson, no longer sat with arrogance. Instead, his posture was rigid, his face tight with the realization of the inevitable. He was no longer in control. Bondi turned her gaze toward the jury. They had been with her every step of the way, watching as the case unfolded. She knew they had witnessed more than just a trial. They had witnessed the breaking of a system that allowed corruption to thrive unchecked for far too long. There was a shift in their expressions, a subtle nodding of heads as if they too understood the gravity of what had transpired. In the back of the room, reporters scribbled furiously, their pens moving as fast as their minds. This wasn't just another courtroom drama, this was history in the making. The arrest of a judge who had long thought himself above the law, the exposure of the corrupt dealings that had stained an entire system, it was something that would be remembered. Bondi took a deep breath, collecting her thoughts. The trial wasn't over, but the path forward was clear. She had exposed the corruption. She had stripped away the facade, and now she would continue to fight for the truth to be fully recognized. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I'd like to submit a formal request to proceed with additional evidence. The arrest of Judge Gates was only the beginning. If there are more names to uncover, we will ensure they are brought to light." The judge's seat, now empty, seemed like a symbol of the shift that had taken place. No longer a place of unchecked power, but one now vulnerable to scrutiny. The room was filled with the energy of something new, a sense of accountability. The kind of change that had once felt impossible was now beginning to take shape. Charles Lawson, still quiet, now knew his world was unraveling. The empire he had built on political favors and deceit was crumbling before his eyes. But he wasn't done. Bondi could sense that. He had information to share, but it wouldn't come easily. It never did with people like him. She turned back to face the defense table, her eyes locking with Lawson's for a moment longer than necessary. She wasn't finished with him yet. "You'll have your chance to speak, Mr. Lawson. But first, the truth must be laid bare. Only then will you find any mercy." Bondi stood tall, her resolve unwavering. The system had been tested, and in this courtroom it had worked. She had shown that no one was above the law, not even the most powerful, the most entrenched. And as she watched the defendant sit there, his silence betraying his fear, she knew that justice was now on the right path. "Let the investigation continue," she said, her voice carrying the weight of the moment. "The truth will come out, and no matter how hard they try, the people involved will face the consequences of their actions." With that, she turned to the jury, their eyes now fixed on her with new respect. They had witnessed more than just a trial. They had witnessed the unraveling of corruption and the beginning of true justice. The courtroom, still reeling from what had just happened, began to settle. The weight of the moment was heavy, but it was a weight that came with the knowledge that the fight for truth was far from over, and Pam Bondi, unshaken and determined, was ready to see it through to the end.